few years ago, one of the leading scholars of The Wind in the Willows, Professor Peter Hunt, made the claim that Kenneth Grahame's classic is a gay manifesto. And since it's Pride Month, I wanted to offer my opinion on the matter. And to do so, I'm going to discuss the life of Kenneth Grahame and go through some of the points that Professor Peter Hunt brings up. And furthermore, I'm going to slightly push back on Professor Hunt's claims. So stick with me if you're interested. And before we move on, please like, subscribe, comment, and all that good jazz. I am on my way to building this channel, and it really means a lot to have your support. So, this literature nerd is going to dive into the tea between the lines. Let's get to it. So, Kenneth Grahame, like many of our classical authors, lived a life of profound sadness. He was born in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and his father loved to drink a little bit too much. So his mother, as a way of probably getting him away from his bad influences in Edinburgh, she decided to move the family to the west coast of Scotland. Grahame describes these days as being idyllic, as fond memories of walks with his father hand in hand and sailing adventures, walking along the marina, seeing the boats, and enjoying the expanse of nature. Sadly, not long after Grahame's 5th birthday, his mother gave birth to his younger brother, Roland, and she shortly thereafter became extraordinarily sick and died. And because his father was in a delicate state of mental health already, he believed himself incapable of caring for the 4 children, and they were sent to live with their maternal grandmother. So there they went to Berkshire, England, and they were sent to their grandmother's manor house, which was called the Mount. And Grahame also writes of very fond memories of this place, of the beautiful sweeping gardens. And although the children, were not emotionally supported by anyone, they had each other and they had the great outdoors. So this gap between the children at this time and the adults in their lives, these children were all but orphans now. And this time in Grahame's life of living at the Mount became the inspiration for his first works of fiction, The Golden Age and Dream Days. And these children's books were groundbreaking at the time because they were told from the point of view of a child. Of course, there had been books written about children up until now, but this was truly a first-person narrative and truly a narrative given through the eyes and the mind of a child. And in the prologue, Grahame describes this gap between the adults and the children, and he dubbed those adults the Olympians. So in the prologue, he writes, "It was incessant matter for amazement how these Olympians would talk over our heads, during meals, for instance, of this or the other social or political inanity, under the delusion that these pale phantasms of reality were among the importances of life. We, Illuminati, eating silently, our heads full of plans and conspiracies, could have told them what real life was. We had just left it outside, and we were all on fire to get back to it." So in these days, Grahame really cemented in his mind what was important about life and what life was all about. It was wandering through these beautiful Edwardian gardens and putting his toy sailboat in the pond and watching it float, and exploring with his siblings, playing pretend games where they would hunt large mammals, or they would play that they were Indian tribes and cowboys, all these wonderful pretend games of childhood. In those days, they were also treated to these lovely rowing excursions with his Uncle David, who also told them stories and taught them how to row. So, you can see now the foundations being laid for The Wind in the Willows. Unfortunately, as would be a running theme in his childhood, these days were cut short. So, first of all, the Olympians made the very cruel and unnecessary decision that the children were too old for toys. So, all the toys were gathered up and they were to be sent off to charity. Grahame writes about sneaking down in the night with his siblings to gather up some of their most favorite toys and then hiding them, burying them out in the garden. And then the roof fell in at the mount, and the manor house was considered too dangerous for the children to live. And from here, they were sent to live here and there. Their father did try to bring them back to Scotland, but he was unable to care for his children due to his mental health and his alcoholism. From the time that Grahame was 9 years old, his father ceased all contact. And from there, Grahame was sent to school at St. Edward's. And despite all that he had been through, he was academically very successful. He always got good marks and he made his way up to head boy. Upon graduation, he joined the Scottish Volunteers and he also joined the new Shakespeare Society. Grahame wished very much to attend Oxford, but the uncle who had been funding his life up until now said, "No, I'm not going to pay for that, and it's time for you to earn your own way into the world." He started working as a clerk for his uncle and then eventually became a clerk at the Bank of England. So Grahame was this incredibly intelligent and capable person, and he proved this further. But while working at the bank, he eventually worked his way up over a span of 30 years. He started at 19 and he retired at 49. He started as a clerk. He worked his way up to secretary of the Bank of England. This is one of the top 3 positions in the Bank of England. It's a pretty big get. Not only did he manage to get the position of secretary, he was at the time the youngest person to ever do so. And the entire time while he was working at the bank, he was jotting down his little imaginations, his little stories on notes, and then he started submitting them to publishers. His first success was the aforementioned duology, The Golden Age, and Dream Days. He was sort of living a double life. His publisher asked him, you should write full time. This is really good. But he wasn't ready to do that. He really wanted to stick with the security of the bank job. And furthermore, we do know that he had a male roommate for a long time, another writer called Tom Gregg. And we also know he lived the bachelor life for a long time. It was quite common in those days to marry young or to have your mind on marriage and to be courting, but he did not. He was not known to pursue women at all. He spent his spare time going on fishing and boating journeys with his boys. And one of his best friends was the writer Arthur Quiller Couch, who they nicknamed Q. And Q became the inspiration for Ratty. The two of them would go on these rambling sailing adventures, spend many nights together out under the stars. Okay, you can see where Professor Peter Hunt starts to get the idea that The Wind in the Willows is a gay manifesto. So let's really get into it and unpack it. Until the age of 40, Grahame was a staunch bachelor. He did not pursue women. Marriage was not on his mind at all. He met Elspeth Thompson in 1897, and she started coming on hard and fast. She started sending him a barrage of letters and confessions of her love and poems and all these things. And at the time, she was in her mid-30s. She was a spinster by those days. And she really saw it as her last chance for marriage. So sending all these words of devotion, and she finally hit the right chord with him when she wrote in a letter, "I wish we had met when I was 4, when we were little children." And she described, being children together. And as we know, Kenneth Grahame has a bit of a hang up there. He's very fixated on this young childhood age and living that life. So when he read that, it really struck a chord with them. So from there, they start exchanging these letters in this very strange baby talk. It's very uncomfortable to read. If you really want to give yourself the ick, we do have the letters, and you can read all the strange baby talk that they sent to one another. And that was what sealed the deal. Now, Graham's sister, Helen, who he was quite close to, she was opposed to the marriage. She did not think it was a good idea. And Grahame himself got cold feet, but the marriage went ahead. At the wedding, Grahame was actually sick, as he was wont to do when he had his little bouts of anxiety. He would make himself sick, which is something I can definitely relate to. But the wedding just went ahead, and it was an immediate disaster. As you can imagine, these fantasy letters of baby talk and things, they don't really translate well to an adult physical relationship. And Grahame spent many nights away from his bride, going on his little sailing jaunts with his boys. Although this was the case, they did eventually produce a son, Alistair. I do want to talk more about Alistair in the second part of this video. I'm doing a short series on Kenneth Grahame, because I really think that the father-son relationship, and specifically the life of Alistair, are key to understanding Grahame and this text. However, let's just focus on this idea of the gay manifesto, because it's a little bit fun, isn't it? So we have a man who was thriving as a bachelor. He had his boys. They would go on their boy adventures, sailing adventures, and he's also living this double life where he's, do I want to be a free man, a bachelor, a sailor, and a writer? Or do I want to be working at the bank and be married and be a father? So you can see how he was, torn between these two worlds. And I can see how that could translate as possibly being in the closet. He eventually wrote The Wind in the Willows, which was mostly inspired, at least the plot, by the stories that he told his son Alistair at bedtime. So in The Wind in the Willows, however, you cannot help but notice a lack of female characters. There are one or two women briefly mentioned, but all the speaking parts, all the important parts, they're all men. And furthermore, it is a story about relationships between men. And when asked to describe the book to his publisher, Grahame described it as clean of the clash of sex. Furthermore, one can't help but notice some of the potentially homoerotic moments in the story, such as when Mole and Rat shake off their garments and tumble in between the sheets in great enjoyment and contentment. Or, while laying out under the open air, Mole reaches out from under his blanket, feels for Rat's paw in the darkness, and gives it a squeeze. "I'll do whatever you like, Ratty," he whispers. Okay, it does come across a little bit sus, but I have to admit here, I have not read the entire book. Professor Peter Hunt wrote an entire book about The Wind in the Willows, in which he called it a gay manifesto. And he is one of the world's leading scholars on Kenneth Grahame and on this text. But was he really in the closet? And is this really a gay manifesto? I have to be honest, I'm not sure it's entirely fair to retroactively out someone or to comment on their sexuality like this. And after all, Grahame was living at a time where homosexuality was illegal. He couldn't be out if he wanted to. And as I said, Professor Peter Hunt is a well-respected academic and researcher, and I would like to read the full book to see the full case presented. But in conclusion, in my opinion, I think it's more fun to let a little air of mystery remain. To me, it seems only right that this jaunt of the imagination and this story of anthropomorphic animals and adventures on the riverbank, live in that liminal space that Grahame himself occupied. Stuck between his own fantasies and his life at the bank, of course, this text would carve out a space where it's okay for talking animals to drive motor cars and go gallivanting through the woods. It may be that Grahame was writing out some of his private life on the page, perhaps without even realizing it. And I say, let him. We all need an outlet, and we also all need to make space for positive relationships between men. Positive relationships that are emotional and sensitive and heartfelt, and that doesn't always mean gay. And this is what I'm going to get into more on my next video when I talk more about Kenneth Grahame and his son Alistair. I hope you enjoyed this video. Once again, please like, subscribe, and all that nonsense, and I'll see you on the next one.